Hello, and welcome back once again to the Inquisitor podcast. Today, my guest is Jay Weiser. Jay is the Chief Catalyst and Navigator of Jay Weiser Consulting, and he advises leadership teams and boards on future-ready governance and leadership. So, Jay, welcome. Today, we're going to be talking about why does PE keep replacing leaders when the operating system is what's failing? So before you replace another CEO or CRO, how do you know whether it's them, the system, or the system is failing the leader?
Glad to be here. I think, what you're describing is something, I see somewhat consistently at the board and C-suite level. I think the CEO, the leader, gets replaced because they're the thing that's most visible. The system is behind the scenes. It doesn't get seen. And when you look at the system, it goes back to how decisions are made, how information flows, what information makes it to the board, and whether or not incentives are aligned. So, that's something I frequently see. And, if you're making all these changes, so you're swapping out the leader, but the system stays the same, you're going to get the results that the system allows to be produced. It's hard to, the system is a constraint. If the system isn't set up right, then it's very hard for, any leader to do that. And it's interesting because, I had this discussion at the PE conference last week, and the CEO is easy to replace. Changing the system, having the board change how they work, getting an operating partner to think and do differently is a challenge. But the thing is, replacing that CEO or chief revenue officer over and over is very costly. It leads to extended hold periods. It leads to a lot of lost value. So, it's the board has to start to see, and when I talk with boards, is think about the value that's being lost. This is significant. If you don't address the underlying problem, you're going to get the same results. So it's about presenting that in a compelling manner.
So what are boards and PE treating as true that the evidence isn't supporting?
So they're seeing a dashboard. The dashboard looks great. Sales look great. But then the question becomes, what's the quality of those sales? Are they surface level sales where, you're just pushing back churn that's going to happen, high cost to serve, things that, are not visible when you're just looking at sales volume versus sales quality is one example. You look at sales growth and you say, oh, customers love our stuff. Well, do they or don't they? You making that initial sale, any salesperson can make that initial sale. The question is it a quality sale where the customer understands what they've been sold, they value what they've been sold, and they see that the company is able to support it, versus, the old joke, you get treated differently as a prospect than you do as a customer, whether or not you're able to back that up.
Well, one of the leading indicators is your churn rate. Another one is your activation rate and adoption rates. And I think far too few organizations really pay attention to that because they pay attention to the cosmetic figures. And I think a lot of this is driven by what looks good to the board. I've had a couple of conversations with clients that are new to me in the last couple of weeks. And in both cases, what their CEO cared about is how it would play out to the board, not whether they were getting information that would enable them to make good decisions. And that then has a ripple effect throughout the organization because as soon as you start playing that theatrics game and worrying about the optics, you start exporting misery. The misery goes to the operations and the customer success team in the onboarding cycle. Operations ends up having to try and fit edge cases because sales has gone after anyone with a pulse who would buy, as opposed to the right ideal customer. Customer success spends an inordinate amount of their time dealing with unhappy customers. I remember one company that I was chatting to recently, and 50% of the companies that they'd sold to didn't really activate. They had sporadic, and then it became shelfware, and the odds of renewal were exceptionally low. So, what are the questions boards need to ask themselves in order to ensure that they're looking at the right end of the problem.
Board members should not just be taking what they see at face value. I recently wrote an article and I was talking about a topic I call information friction or information flow. And by the time it reaches the board, very often, to your point around optics, it's been polished, it's been filtered, it's been averaged, it's been aggregated. So, you can make anything look good when you do that. If the board accepts that at face value and doesn't question it, what happens usually is, things go happily along for a couple of quarters, maybe, and then all of a sudden, something flashes red on the dashboard because now sales have dropped or churn is skyrocketed. And all of a sudden the board says, where the heck did this come from? And then they start exploring. And as they start to explore and question, CEO probably gets defensive, the sales exec gets defensive. And if they keep on pushing, what they'll find out is, 6 or 9 months earlier, these signals were there, but these were not signals that the board was seeing. Since the board wasn't seeing them, the board can't act on them. So, and the other thing to ask, looking at sales in churn, is looking retrospectively. So you're looking at last quarter, last month. What the board should be talking about is, what does next quarter, next month, asking questions like, what would put this number at risk? And it's also the board, not just talking to the CEO and the CFO. The board should periodically be meeting, or directors meeting with, the heads of customer success, the head of operations, to understand the different risk factors. If they're not doing that, if it's a passive board, then, those situations tend to get ugly.
Well, what I see is poor quality revenue doesn't just churn, but it shows up later as a haircut on enterprise value. It weakens renewal confidence, it increases cost to serve, it stretches the hold period, and it makes the exit story harder to defend. So, what advice would you give to a chief revenue officer who's just coming into post? Where should they look? What should they do in order to establish what is quality revenue versus the wrong type of revenue?
So I think in that initial period, it's incumbent on them to ask those questions of their people, to talk to customers, talk to new customers, talk to customers who have been here a year, talk to customers who are coming up for renewal. So they get a full view. And that way, the chief revenue officer can set and manage expectations in terms of what the board can expect and what they're going to look at. That instead of looking at the board as an adversary, look more at the board as a thinking partner. So the board can provide insight versus just oversight looking backwards. The board can ask questions and gets the chief revenue officer and others to think. It's also, the chief revenue officer touch a subject, but they should be looking at incentives. What kind of behavior is the incentive system driving? And is it the right behavior?
And the metric system. So, what do they measure? A very successful serial CRO that I know, he's done 15 successful exits for PE. His starting point is always go and speak to operations and find out what type of work they do exceptionally well, they love to do, and they can do blindfold. And then he goes and looks at the pipeline, and it's almost always the case that 80% of the pipeline does not fit that profile. And that weak revenue erodes the multiple of a fund, and the damage that appears downstream, often close to exit. So I think a major challenge here is how do we identify fragile revenue that affects buyer confidence in the diligence and the buying stage?
Well, so a couple of things. One, what are some leading indicators that show this is an issue? If clear targeting criteria before a sale gets accepted, so that maybe there needs to be an operating person combined with a salesperson in terms of reviewing sales and having some earlier involvement in doing that, involving customer success earlier and thinking about what drives activation, what kind of onboarding is necessary. On the incentive side, salespeople, I would say, shouldn't just be paid commissions on volume, but there should be a portion of their compensation that is tied to customer duration. So they get incented more if a customer stays. It is a disincentive if they bring on customers that leave, and that needs to have a financial impact on them. To there's a counterweight there.
Well, I'm with you 100%. I mean, when I talk to people about building their incentive scheme, I think, yes, absolutely, for bringing the right customer on board, there should be a proportion of commission paid. But at renewal, and by the third renewal, I think that's where you should be paying out a lot, so that because this will also affect retention of good talent. And the team that is involved, rather than individual contributors alone being commissioned. CS and account management and new business sales teams need to work together and collaboratively. So I think poor revenue not only shows up as a haircut, but what we see is that it extends hold periods. And a PE can't put their finger on it, and the operating partner is there tearing their hair out. And boards are focused on growth but not durability. And if the revenue isn't holding, it's no good letting it come through the front door if you're letting it out the back door, because every dollar that goes out of the back door, you have to replace to stand still. And the cost of sale, the cost of service, is astronomical by comparison to doing a good job in the first place and targeting the right people and incenting the teams to do the right thing. So you stop importing future value loss disguised as growth.
It's interesting because you raised a number of things. You talked about individual contributor. I've always been an advocate of, I'll call it a tiered incentive program. There's the company piece. The company has to be successful. The company has to be profitable. If you're a great salesperson, but the company's failing, that doesn't matter. So there needs to be some gains, and also tied to the team. So that way they have a vested interest in what goes on in the rest of the organization in terms of operations, in terms of customer success. That's one piece. The second piece, you mentioned about going out to year 3. You got to look at the cost to acquire a customer and the cost to serve a customer, because not every customer is necessarily profitable. The third piece, and I go back to some of my background in performance measurement and balanced scorecard, and people say, oh, it's really hard to measure that. How do we know the customer fit? The customer fits. Having a measure. I mean, I wrote down the percentage of new customers that were fit to serve. So having some defined criteria. So you're tiering your customers in terms of your fitness to serve, and you're asking for some justification. If somebody says, oh, really not fit to serve them, but my God, the deal is big and we think we can build that capability, and here's our plan for doing that, might make perfect sense. But if there's no plan in place, to your point, you're just kicking the can down the road and you're going to have to deal with it.
Well, I think poor quality revenue doesn't fail at the moment that it's reported. It sends signals first, and the board's job is to make sure that those signals arrive early enough to act. So when boards say, where did this come from? What signals are already showing as leading indicators that perhaps aren't showing up in the board packs or the dashboards?
So again, I think that goes back to the access they have to some of these other teams. Talking to teams and saying what types of things. Let's just say talking to the head of operations. what are your top 3 or 4 headaches that lead to customers defecting, that lead to customer complaints? And you can measure those to see how quickly they're coming. Are they happening in the first 3 months, 6 months, year? At what point do they bubble up? So to start understanding and diagnosing what those signals look like and separating the noise from what are meaningful signals. What are things, leading indicators that are going to be predictive of future success, or they're going to impact future success? So having your marketing team do some statistical analysis and tracking certain factors can help you identify what makes sense. And part of that means the measures might change, because it takes a little bit of trial and error to figure out, which are the ones that actually move the dial. I always talk about metrics need to pass the so what test. If I got this information, what would I do differently? Am I getting information here that's going to inform a decision, that's going to tell me how to act? Or, is it just history? And when I get the information, I can't do anything about it. I get a sales number, great. That's history. But if I get a measure that shows, operations runs into issues with most accounts in the first 3 months, well, that's something I should look into and explore. So it's looking at what, is this something that moves the lever? And is this something that informs a decision? Is this something that I can act on? And it's incumbent on the board and, other executives to be, having constructive challenge. If I always say, if something looks too good to be true, it often is too good to be true. So it doesn't mean adversarial, but it does mean pressure testing. And there might be changes in circumstances. A competitor might be doing something different. Business model might be changing. A new technology might be coming out. The point is, understand the context you're in and understand these leading indicators.
I think there are a few questions that boards should be asking and getting true answers to. Is the customer using the product or service? Are they getting the value they intended without us having to try and rescue them? Can we support them profitably? Would they renew without heroics? And I think a really awkward and uncomfortable question is, would this survive diligence? If they knew what was under the bonnet, under the hood, would they buy? And I see far too few organizations like that. So I'll give you a great example that we're going through at the moment. My daughter bought a car. It's a hybrid, and the stop start isn't working. So it's basically burning through fuel. And she's had it in and out of the garage for 3 months since she bought it. It's been in there a week. They keep telling us that it's not showing up on the diagnostics, so it's all fine. They keep having to charge the battery. But the reality is that if the experience first use does not match expectation, then buyer's remorse sets in. And all she's had for 3 months is buyer's remorse. And it's created rancor, and it's wasted an inordinate amount of the manufacturer's customers' time. My wife has been on the phone for hours. My daughter's been on the phone and in and out of the garage for hours. We're now getting to the point where we're thinking of invoicing them. And if that's our experience, what we say to other people about this particular brand and the service that we received is not going to be beneficial. And that, again, I think is something that many boards fail to realize. What are people saying behind your back? Is it what you want them to, or is it not?
You've raised a number of issues. And I think back to some of my experiences as a customer. What happens? Customers have a couple of different options. Do I raise my hand, speak up, try and talk to the right people to make them aware of the problem? If they're aware of the problem, what do they do to address it? Do they recover, or do they just continue to piss me off? In this case, they've continued to piss you off. And that's where instead of being a raving fan, you become the opposite. You become a terrorist and you start telling everybody else about your experience, which can have a significant impact on a business where trust and integrity is really important. Now, one of the questions I always ask is, how do you know what the customer thinks? Just because they bought something, are you looking at number of garage visits, number of dealer visits within the first 3 months? If you're seeing a lot of those, you're like, why are we making our customers come back to the dealer? So there are things to look at that are easy to access. Do we have some sort of follow-up survey? And it's not, I get surveys up the yin yang. Every time I go to the doctor, they send me a survey. Every time I go to Home Depot, I bought a bag of fertilizer. What was my experience? So the question is, it's not enough to ask. You have to follow up on the information you're given. So the board needs to be out there talking to customers. The board needs to be out there, seeing what's happening.
Managed by walking around, eh? I mean,
Well,
what I keep seeing. Sorry,
it's
go on.
not it's not walking around, it's listening.
Yeah.
Because if you're just walking around, it's about listening and doing. Just
Fair point.
because you hear it and you go, oh, that customer is just pissed off. Oh, that one's just pissed off. Oh, that's an aberration. Well, if enough aberrations happen, it's not an aberration, it's a system issue.
Well, one thing that's worth listening to and asking in the pipeline reviews is, are the buyers driving it forward proactively, or are sellers chasing? That's a really good indicator that there's something wrong. Is it weak fit or good fit? Is it timing? Is it relevance? Are they offering value? Another great metric that almost no one pays any attention to, which baffles me, is time to value. How long does it take for the customer to report back that they got the value that they intended when they made the investment? And that drives usage, adoption, renewal, expansion, recommendation and referrals. And almost nobody pays any attention to that. Customer interviews. You need to go and speak to customers and understand their buying journey. You need to understand what they did, what their centers of dissatisfaction were, what were the triggers that caused them to go and look to hire a new solution. What was the process they went through when they were looking passively and they were trying to learn how to solve their problem? What was the process they went through when they were actively looking and exploring their options? When they were deciding, what were the trade-offs they made? I'm remember when Anna bought this car, she researched it for months. She then started making trade-offs and she wanted to go for a hybrid. And one of the reasons why she went with this one was because of their warranty. And so she bought a car that fit her trade-off requirements as well as her functional needs. And the net result of that is that on first use, if first use does not exactly match expectation, buyer's remorse sets in. And that's been her story on this occasion, but I'm sure it's not, I know it's not unique, because service, as you said, to existing customers is often far worse than to prospects. So they bend over backwards until they have your money. And then you kind of get kicked into the long grass. So that then affects renewals, because chances of her buying another one of these, car from this brand, I think are pretty much damaged. And I'm looking for a new car at the moment. And I was considering one, but there's no way I'm buying from them.
Let's take this up a level. We've talked about individual experiences. We've talked about different issues that customers are raising. We've talked about, people chasing certain numbers because that's what they're being incented on, but not looking at quality. All of these things point back to systemic issues and going back to the board and the leadership team. Having various members having the courage to raise these as issues and say, why aren't we looking at these things? Now, when you do that, a couple of different things happen. One, the CEO could say, "Oh, I'm on top of that. Don't worry about it. That's just a blip." Well, the first quarter, maybe. If that persists, the board needs to challenge, and the board needs to ask for more information, not just the filtered information they're getting. And it means they need to step out of the boardroom and actually talk to customers. When the CEO says, "Oh, our customers love our products. Look at how fast sales are growing." Board members should raise their hand and say, "How do we know? What kind of surveying are we doing? Who are we talking to?" Because sure, sales are growing because we have great advertising, we have great marketing, we're doing great publicity. But if people aren't satisfied or running into issues, that's a problem. So it comes back to somebody who's willing to challenge and making sure that the culture allows for that sort of a challenge. If every challenge is brushed off, or the chair of the board isn't doing his or her job, and allowing that constructive debate to happen, then those systemic elements need to be challenged. It's not going to fix itself. It requires somebody to ask those questions and to ask the follow-up questions. A good board member or a good leader does not have all the answers, but they should be asking questions downstream to make sure they can help guide and advise the right decisions. And they need to say, is the problem them or is the problem us? And they have to have, I'll say, emotional intelligence. They need to have the self and other awareness to be able to say, "This sounds fishy. Tell me more about that."
Well,
And
sorry, go on.
yeah, I mean, and the other part I was going to say, I heard a leader say, the key thing that's important is to prosecute the argument, not the person. And all too often, if you're directing something at a person and they feel attacked, they're naturally going to become defensive. If you pose a question and say, "Hey, we are all looking at the success of the company. Success is driven by X, Y, and Z. How do we know how X, Y, and Z are performing? We collectively should be interested in improving this. How can we help you? What resources do you need?" So it's done from more of a collaborative mindset.
Well, I think what we need to do is we need to explore the evidence behind the story that we're hearing. And one of the things that I've developed is a value evidence um, audit that allows you to check out the evidence under the story. Because if you're not paying attention to what's really happening, you're going to get a glossed over version. And to build on your point, if people are punished for telling the truth, they'll learn that it's safer not to. They'll doctor things. So it's a bit like having cosmetic surgery. Um, what you're doing is you're making it pretty for the board pack, but they're then basing their decisions on incomplete, inaccurate, or wrong information. And I don't think boards make bad decisions because they're stupid. They make bad decisions because confidence in the story outruns the evidence. The board pack tells a clean story, the numbers look fine, and the debate happens outside the pack. By the time the evidence catches up, the decision's already been made, and those decisions might have lasting ripple effects. The misery is exported to other parts of the business, and then customer success and account management are blamed for customers churning. Operations is having their time eaten up, so it drives up cost of service. Edge cases keep coming because sales and marketing have targeted the wrong people. They've gone after the total addressable market instead of the serviceable, obtainable market, who forms your ideal customer profile. Um, and I think it's so important to create the conditions of psychological safety where you are not punished for telling the truth or for asking awkward questions. But those people who do are often labeled as being difficult or obstructive, they're passed over for promotion. And where I see the best managers, the chap that I said had a fantastic track record, 15 PE exits, he will not lie to the board. He'll tell them what the forecast is and say, that's the forecast. Well, it's a bit low. We need it to look higher. No, is his answer. And so far, he's managed to generate 15 really successful, highly profitable exits by doing that. But very few people in the CRO role have the courage to stand up to the board. Um, and I think it needs a supportive environment where the CRO, the CEO, the CFO are working together to tell the truth to the board so that they can make good decisions on the basis of fact, not fiction and not hope.
So a couple of things. When you talk about that chief revenue officer, I suspect it's not just saying no, but it's talking about what are the trade-offs. Yes, I can get more revenue. This is what we're going to have to give up. This is the impact of doing that. Now the board can make an informed decision. Is this something they want or don't want, and why? I had a client who said there's nothing worse than bad news late.
Yeah.
The system in today's world where there's persistent turbulence, there's complexity, there's accelerating change, does not guarantee a particular outcome. But the system should improve your probability of getting a good outcome. So thinking about how do you find things out sooner? Part of it is creating the conditions so that information bubbles up. Part of it is asking better questions and boards, not just saying, how do we do this month, but saying, looking at the likelihood of that continuing and asking questions, what's our renewal rate? How much effort are we having to put into renewal, or a customer is just approving it? How do we maintain touch points with our clients? Because sometimes, automatic renewal just happens. Well, that renewal doesn't mean the customer's happy. So it's, are you having those discussions with customers? And again, it goes back to, boards very often talk about noses in, fingers out. The board is detached, the board's passive, the board's removed. I talk about brains in, fingers out. The board needs to be engaged in those discussions. The board needs to be curious. If a board's not curious, that's not a good sign. You want the board to be curious. You want them to be asking questions so they get the information they need in a timely manner. And sometimes you need to do it. It's not just, asking the CEO or the chief revenue officer, give me some customers I can talk to. A better question is, give me the list of 10, 15 organizations that didn't renew and who your contact person was. And then the board picks and chooses who they want to talk to. So there's an element of randomness in the selection, so the board can actually get some insights. So it's thinking about, moving from deterministic thinking, if we do this, we'll get this, to more probabilistic thinking and saying, are we doing things to increase the likelihood of getting a particular outcome?
Well, I think building on what you've said, I think we should ask at every meeting, what did we learn this week that makes the plan less certain, and who raised the risk early, and reward them for it. Don't just reward the person, or don't reward the person who saved the deal and put their underpants on the outside and donned a red cape. Reward the person who exposed the problem early. Make bad news a standing item, not any risks, but what got worse since last week? What could fail if we're wrong? Which deal, a counter assumption, worries us most? Look at the pack and speak to the head of CS without the CRO there. Speak to operations without the CEO there. Speak to customers without management being present, and ask what's harder than it should be. Demand evidence, not summaries. Not are customers happy? Which customers? What have they done that proves that? What would make them leave? Pull decisions forward. Don't wait for the numbers to move. What decisions are we about to regret? What are we assuming is true that we've not tested? You've got to run to the sound of gunfire and go looking for bad news so that you don't end up paying the price for it later. What are the trade-offs? Are we making them explicit? If we push for growth, what will break if we do this faster? Where will costs show up later so that the bad news becomes visible? And I think you've got to separate challenge from attack. Test the decision, not the person. And if the challenge gets shut down, even once, that'll disappear.
Well, and the thing too, when a PE firm comes in, this should be part of their due diligence. Because if they're not asking these questions at the outset, if they're not testing some of these assumptions, then they're going to get bad news late. If they do a better job at due diligence, they can begin to put a plan in place on how to address this. So part of this is the PE firm being proactive and the deal team looking at due diligence to say, is this something we have the capability to fix or address? One. Two, does the team we have in place, are they going to be able to make the changes? Or are they so tied to legacy and past behaviors that they're unlikely to change? Well, maybe, those are not people we should keep. You can't just assume all these things are going to happen. And just because, we can make more of X and we can sell more of X, but if we don't have the capacity or capability to deliver X and sustain X, then that's a problem. Sales gets ahead of operations, or sales product people develop something. They toss it over the fence to salespeople sell it, and operations says, oh shit, I didn't know anything about this. We're not ready to deal with it. Well, that's a problem. Why wasn't operations brought into the discussion earlier? So that when these plans come up and people are projecting sales, operations should be in the room, because they can temper some of those expectations by making sure they have the capacity to deliver, exposing those risks earlier so an informed decision can be made. So if they say, oh, well, we don't have the capability, well, maybe there needs to be some flexible staffing arrangement, some sort of setup. How are we going to handle this if this arises? If you create a culture, to your point, you talked about people getting rewarded. If everybody thinks that finding risk and alerting people to risk is part of their job, then they're more apt to bring these issues up. If they think it's not part of their job, that's somebody higher up somewhere else, they're going to let things slide. It's not my job. It's not my problem.
Well, you touched on something really important as well, which is, are PE firms asking the right questions in the diligence stage? Because they price risk into how much they're going to pay for a company. And as a founder and the founding board, if you don't have a solid understanding of answers to questions like, what was the last major surprise? And when did the evidence first appear? What happens when the founder is told the plan is wrong? What claims in the board pack are source-backed and evidence-backed, and which are narrative? What revenue needs being rescued, discounting, or exception work to hold? If part of the forecast disappeared, is it because only one buyer was present? What evidence do you have that this is a priority for them? I had a conversation recently where a sale for medical devices was lost to the need to build a car park in a hospital because patients were having to walk 10 or 15 minutes to get to A&E. And so everything was spent on building the car park. And the failure to ask the right questions and look at context is really key. If bad news cannot travel, evidence can't be challenged or can't challenge the story, and the founder can't be wrong safely, the asset is not fit for serious capital. So they're going to price that risk into any offer that they make, but many of them just won't make the offer because they've got plenty of deal flow.
Well, that goes back to the quality of due diligence. And when I was at this PE conference last week, deal teams get recognized for making deals. They want to make deals. They want to close. Sometimes there's competitive pressure to bid by certain time. Oh, we don't have time to do due diligence, or we can't do as much as we thought. Well, is there a plan to address that early? And is there understanding of that risk? The other part that's interesting when you think about due diligence, there was some discussion last week about should the deal team not just get compensated on closing the deal, but should there be some sort of deferred compensation tied to the success of the deal? Because very often it hasn't been sold right or bought right. And the deal team might say, oh, I don't have any control over that. Well, yeah, you do, because you made the deal. So you should have a vested interest in setting this up for success. And look, have you considered these factors? And that's why, I've developed this multiplicative value model, which forces an organization to, if a PE firm comes in, they should be saying, do we have the capacity and capability to oversee this? Is this an industry we've worked in? Do we have an operating partner that has experience in this? Is this outside of our wheelhouse? That they can look at the quality of leadership. And it's not just looking, individual assessments, is looking at how does that team perform? How have they performed under stress? How have they demonstrated adaptability? How have they demonstrated, a culture? Have they cultivated a culture that shares information, is open and transparent, or, is it the opposite? And we need to consider that as a risk. Each of those things link to ultimate deal success. If a deal is questionable at the start, it's going to take longer to get to that exit. You throw in other external factors, whether it be tariffs, fuel prices, trade wars, interest rates. You mentioned about context. You want leaders who can adapt, who don't just say, okay, this is our plan. We're sticking with this plan no matter what happens. You need leaders who can adapt and change, and you need a board that is reasonable. I say reasonable. So one of the operating partners said, in our firm, when we make an investment, we know things don't happen overnight. We know there's a ramp up time. We know in the beginning we need to be more hands-on to support the success of the deal. Part of this is some rule clarity about what the board is supposed to be doing, what the leadership team is supposed to be doing, what are the requirements of the dynamics between the two. All of that is, are determinants of, whether or not this deal or this portfolio of deals is going to be successful.
Is the lack of individual accountability really at the heart of this? Because you've got LPs end up paying the price in underperformance and lower returns. If you make a bad investment, then the portco ends up with a debt burden, and they're probably being forced to cut costs. There's pressure, and they're distracted from the job in hand. The CEO gets blamed for executing a flawed thesis, and the OP's operating partners inherit the problems that they didn't underwrite. Employees suffer from restructuring and burnout and loss of jobs. And it seems to me that there's some really critical structural dysfunction here. But talking to some of my pals in PE, they don't seem to really mind so much because they're going to win either way. They win on the fees, they win on the carry, and because as long as they're not a small cap, they've probably got a spread, and maybe 3 or 4% of their investments need to wash their face well. for them to, or maybe a little bit more than that, maybe 8%. The others can fall by the wayside and they're not really affected by it. So is there a way that this can be fixed, or is it just too comfortable because of the way that the funding market has been set up? So they're immune to the impact.
So I don't think they're immune to the impact. I think when you start looking at longer hold periods, you're looking at, I like to call it realizable value. The deal was supposed to produce X and now we got 80% of X. If that starts to happen to more and more of the companies in a portfolio, then portfolio performance goes down. Yes, there's going to be a mix of deals that a fund will make. Some are high risk, high reward. Some are low risk, high reward. You're looking in the same way you think about a stock, retirement or stock portfolio in terms of the type of investments you make. There's accountability at different levels in terms of compensation. In return. So when I was at this event last week, there was a company that presented called Ownership Works. And essentially, there's word on the street, so to speak. On these PE deals, the PE teams make a lot of money. There's a select handful of operating executives who, if the deal goes good, make a lot of money. An imbalance of some shorter term incentives, or potentially, say, not treating employees as well or enabling them. And what this particular company does, they work with PE firms, one of which was KKR, and they create a pool at the beginning of the deal, and it's set up that if the company performs above a certain level, that pool increases. And that pool is split amongst all employees. So it's not just to the top 3 or 4, it's all employees. As part of that, there's education about what it means to be an owner, because all employees become owners. So they have a vested interest in the success of the company. They're taught how the company makes money and what the different levers are. As owners, they make better decisions because they have a vested interest. You don't have as much turnover. You have more transparency and communication. Information is shared because that's what you do with owners. So that creates a completely different culture. And it's about making the pie bigger. So it's not like they're taking money away from other people and they don't have to make an investment. So there's no downside risk. To an employee, they just might not make extra. But in the deals, numbers have been very successful where the multiple on exit, according to their statistics and in their sample set, the multiple was 1.5 times higher. Employees, in some of these more successful deals, were getting payouts between 5 and 10 times their annual salary. These were life-changing amounts. And these companies did incredibly well because of the culture they created early. And that addresses a lot of what we've been talking about. It's not just about pointing the finger of accountability. It's about, you need ownership and you need enablement. And then people don't mind being accountable. But if accountability is more about blame, and it's a combination of individual and collective accountability. And in the recognition, I talked about not just rewarding individual contributors, but rewarding a team or a collection of departments that have to work together. Because if they're not working together, they're working for different purposes or against each other. That's when you create friction. That's when you create drag. That's when value gets lost.
Jay, we've come to time. This has been really instructive. Thank you so much. How do people get hold of you?
So they can reach me, connect with me on LinkedIn, number 1. Number 2, email me, Jay, at Jay Weiser, JAYWEISCR.com. more than happy to set up a discovery call, talk about the parameters of a deal, discuss a challenge that's being faced, and really look at how governance, leadership, and culture can help you drive value. Or if it's not, going well, I can show you what it's costing you and drive that case for change.
Excellent. Jay Weiser, thank you.
My pleasure.
So this is Marcus Cauchi signing off once again from the Inquisitor podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please like, comment, and share. And before you back the next plan, test the evidence behind it. If you want to know where value is fragile, real, overstated, then contact me. One decision, one evidence check. Take about 5 days. In the meantime, stay safe and happy investing. Bye-bye.